Why do smart people take catastrophic risks? I mean, seriously, have you ever watched a brilliant, highly successful professional completely self-destruct for some seemingly pointless thrill? And you're just sitting there thinking, what on earth were they thinking? Well, what if I told you they weren't just losing their minds? Actually, scratch that. They were following a very strict, albeit pretty dark, set of rules.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to our explainer on Underworld Games, the Anatomy of Escalation, which is based on some truly fascinating insights from the text, Games People Play. Today we're going to totally unpack the exact mechanics of why entirely rational individuals systematically destroy their careers, their stability, or even their lives just for a thrill. We've got a high-energy, highly structured journey ahead of us today, and I am absolutely thrilled to figure out this complex puzzle with you.
So here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off with playing dangerous games, then move right into the psychology of risk. After that, we'll examine the escalation loop, look at some real-world Underworld games, and finally, figure out how to stop the game altogether.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Playing Dangerous Games.
You know, the craziest thing is, it's not madness, it's actually a system. When we see someone literally blow up their life, it looks like this chaotic, completely random, destructive behavior. But as the source material shows us, it's not random at all. It's actually a highly predictable adaptation that's driven by completely misaligned incentives. There's a hidden structure at work here, and we're going to crack it open.
And that brings us to the core mechanism itself, Underworld games. These are defined as structured psychological patterns, where individuals repeatedly engage in socially or legally risky behavior just to obtain intense emotional payoffs. So, what kind of payoffs are we talking about? Well, players are usually seeking power, a massive thrill, control, or maybe even revenge. And the absolute critical piece to understand here, they are actively sacrificing their long-term stability and safety just to get that immediate emotional hit. It's wild.
Because these are definitely not your normal, everyday social interactions, right? Underworld games have some very specific core traits. They are high stakes, norm-violating, identity-consuming, and incredibly escalation-prone. They absolutely thrive in environments where institutional enforcement is kind of weak, and where certain subcultures actually tolerate or, get this, even reward deviant behavior. Basically, the anonymity and total lack of immediate consequences create this perfect playground for destruction.
Moving on to Section 2, the psychology of risk. Let's step directly inside the brain of the risk taker.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive internal shift taking place. Stable satisfaction versus risk-reward emotional substitution. For the players of these games, the basic human desire for rational, stable rewards, it's completely replaced by a dopamine-driven emotional payoff. The intense emotional stimulation of taking that risk essentially hijacks their brain, entirely substituting the steady, long-term satisfaction that most of us naturally seek out.
The source points to this honestly terrifying foundational reality. Risk becomes the primary emotional regulation mechanism. For these individuals, normal emotional regulation has completely 100% failed. The thrill of the game, exploiting blind spots, intimidating others, constantly pushing the boundaries, that becomes the literal only thing keeping them psychologically balanced. They aren't acting out of logic anymore. They are desperately seeking stimulation just to regulate a totally broken baseline.
Okay, Section 3, the escalation loop. So how do these isolated psychological moments lock into these vicious, self-feeding cycles? Let's walk through this feedback loop step by step, almost treating it like a giant game board. Step 1 is minor deviance, just a small broken rule or a tiny transgression. Then, moving to Step 2, there's absolutely no immediate consequence because, as we mentioned, enforcement is weak. Which leads directly to Step 3, increased confidence. The player realizes, hey, I got away with it. And that forces Step 4, higher risk behavior, which provides an even stronger emotional rush. So getting away with something small inevitably builds toward catastrophe because it rapidly recalibrates their risk threshold higher and higher and higher.
This is who I am. Wow. Just let that sink in for a second. This chilling phrase represents what the text calls the identity lock-in loop. You see, when someone repeatedly breaks the rules and rides that escalation loop long enough, their behavior eventually solidifies into an inescapable core identity. It's no longer just a bad thing they did, it is fundamentally who they are, and that drastically reduces their psychological ability to ever just walk away from the system.
Which brings us to Section 4, Real-World Underworld Games. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how we can zoom out to the macro level and actually see these exact same loops playing out across massive global systems.
Seriously, look at how identically this phenomenon manifests across entirely different domains. On Wall Street, in trading, you see these gambling-style addiction loops where high-variance emotional reinforcement just completely replaces financial discipline. In cybersecurity, it's the insider threat, rule-breaking that goes completely undetected and just becomes normalized deviance. In geopolitics, we constantly see escalation spirals in conflict zones, where tiny violations normalize much larger breaches. And incredibly, even in artificial intelligence, we see reward hacking behaviors. From high finance to AI, the underlying structural logic of the Underworld game is exactly the same.
Now, the source text offers an absolutely crucial modern critique here that we really need to acknowledge. This behavior isn't always just some deviant personality trait. Actually, it often emerges as a structural survival adaptation when the environments themselves fail. The systemic drivers here include environmental constraint collapse, incentive misalignment, weak institutional enforcement, and super high exit costs. When the systems are fundamentally broken, high-risk behavior can literally become an adaptive response to survive in that specific environment.
But listen, no matter the system, this is always the dominant pattern. Reward is immediate. Punishment is delayed. That right there is the fundamental structural flaw driving every single Underworld game. When an environment allows this intense emotional payoff to happen right now, today, while the consequences are pushed far, far off into some uncertain future, the escalation loop becomes absolutely 100% self-reinforcing. There's just no way around it.
All right, finally, Section 5, How to Stop the Game. Let's talk solutions.
So the crucial point is system containment logic. To design environments that actually neutralize these threats, you must do 4 key things. First, reduce the delay of consequences. You've got to make that punishment gap as small and visible as humanly possible. Second, disrupt those identity narratives. Do not let the individual ever start believing this is who I am. Third, break escalation pathways early, stepping in well before the deviance becomes normalized. And fourth, you have to provide alternative reward systems that replace all that risky stimulation with healthy, stable satisfaction.
Because honestly, if you don't implement those strategies, you are going to hit this failure threshold known as the collapse condition. A system permanently collapses when escalation behavior becomes identity-based and is socially reinforced way beyond the cost of reversal. This is the ultimate point of no return. Once a subculture fully validates the risk and the individual's identity is entirely locked in, the system is fundamentally broken. At that point, intervention has simply come too late. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. Think about your own workplace, your community, or maybe even your own personal habits. Where are you tolerating delayed consequences in your own systems? Are you accidentally leaving the back door open for an Underworld game to begin? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. I really hope this gives you a powerful new lens to understand the hidden games happening all around us.